Welcome to week 3 in business forecasting class. This week, we shall discuss time series decomposition. Time series data, observations recorded over time, often contain multiple underlying patterns. To better understand what is happening in such data, it is useful to break the series into smaller, more meaningful parts, with each part representing a specific type of pattern. This process is called decomposition, and it allows us to see the structure of the data more clearly rather than viewing it as one complex sequence. Generally, time series patterns fall into 3 main categories: trend, seasonality, and cycles. The trend reflects the long-term direction of the data, whether it is increasing, decreasing, or stable over time. Seasonality refers to regular and repeating patterns that occur at fixed intervals, such as daily, monthly, or yearly. Cycles are longer-term fluctuations that do not follow a fixed schedule, but still show recurring rises and falls. In practice, the trend and cycles are often combined into a single component called the trend cycle, simplifying the analysis. This means that a time series is typically divided into 3 main components: the trend cycle, long-term movement, the seasonal component, repeating short-term patterns, and the remainder, random noise or unexplained variation. In some cases, especially with high-frequency data like hourly or daily observations, there may even be multiple seasonal patterns, such as both weekly and yearly effects. In this chapter, we focus on common techniques used to extract these components from a time series. Breaking the data into these parts helps us better understand its behavior and can significantly improve the accuracy of forecasts. However, before performing decomposition, it is sometimes necessary to transform or adjust the data, such as stabilizing variance or removing irregularities, so that the patterns become easier to identify and analyze. To make this clearer, consider a simple example. Imagine tracking the daily sales of an ice cream shop over 2 years. The trend cycle might show that overall sales are gradually increasing because the shop is becoming more popular. The seasonal component would reflect predictable spikes during summer months and drops during winter, since people buy more ice cream when it is hot. The remainder would include unexpected variations, such as a sudden drop in sales due to a rainy week or a temporary increase during a local festival. By separating these components, the shop owner can better understand what is driving sales and make more accurate predictions for future demand. Time series data, values recorded over time, often contain several overlapping patterns, which can make them difficult to interpret at first glance. To simplify analysis, these data are usually broken down into distinct components, each representing a different type of underlying behavior. This process, known as decomposition, helps analysts better understand how the data evolves and what factors are influencing it. In most cases, a time series can be separated into 3 main parts: a trend cycle component, which captures the long-term direction and broader fluctuations, a seasonal component, which reflects regular and repeating patterns, and a remainder component, which includes irregular or random variations that cannot be explained by the first 2. In practical terms, this means that any observed value in a time series can be viewed as the combination of these components. For instance, in an additive model, the observed data is simply the sum of the trend cycle, seasonal, and remainder parts. However, in cases where fluctuations grow as the level of the data increases, common in economic data, a multiplicative approach may be more appropriate, where the components interact proportionally rather than additively. This distinction is important because it affects how we interpret patterns and build forecasting models. Before decomposing a time series, it is often useful to first simplify the data through various adjustments and transformations. These adjustments remove known sources of variation that could otherwise distort the analysis. For example, calendar adjustments correct for differences in the number of days across months, ensuring that variations are not simply due to longer or shorter periods. Population adjustments convert totals into per capita values, allowing for more meaningful comparisons over time when population size changes. Inflation adjustments standardize monetary values so that they are comparable across years, despite changes in purchasing power. Finally, mathematical transformations, such as logarithms or Box-Cox transformations, can stabilize variability and make patterns more consistent and easier to model. To illustrate this in a simple and intuitive way, imagine you are analyzing monthly electricity consumption in a growing city. The trend cycle would show the long-term increase in electricity use as the city expands and more households are built. The seasonal component would reflect predictable spikes during summer due to air conditioning and during winter due to heating. Meanwhile, the remainder component would capture unexpected changes, such as a sudden drop in usage during a citywide blackout or an unusual spike during a heat wave. However, before analyzing this data, you might adjust it for population growth to see electricity use per household, correct for the number of days in each month, and even apply a logarithmic transformation if consumption variability increases over time. By doing this, the patterns become clearer, and any forecast you make about future electricity demand become much more reliable. The concept of moving averages is one of the earliest and most fundamental techniques used in time series analysis. Developed in the early 20th century, it remains widely used today because of its simplicity and effectiveness in identifying underlying patterns in data. The main idea behind a moving average is to smooth out short-term fluctuations by averaging nearby observations, allowing us to better see the long-term movement, also known as the trend cycle. In simple terms, a moving average works by taking a fixed number of consecutive data points, called the order of the moving average, and computing their average. This average then moves forward through time as new observations are added and old ones are dropped. For example, in a 5-period moving average, each value is calculated by averaging 5 consecutive observations centered around a specific time point. Because nearby observations tend to have similar values, this process reduces random noise and produces a smoother curve that highlights the overall direction of the data. The choice of how many observations to include, the order of the moving average, directly affects how smooth the resulting trend appears. A smaller order captures more detail but may still contain noise, while a larger order produces a smoother curve but may hide important short-term changes. Typically, odd-numbered orders, like 3, 5, or 7, are preferred because they are symmetric, meaning they use an equal number of observations before and after the time point being estimated. Sometimes, moving averages are applied more than once to improve the smoothing process. For example, an even-numbered moving average, like a 4-period average, can be followed by another moving average, such as a 2-period average, to create a centered moving average. This ensures symmetry and helps produce a more balanced and accurate estimate of the trend cycle. Additionally, combining moving averages can lead to weighted moving averages, where some observations are given more importance than others, resulting in even smoother and more refined trends. A particularly important application of moving averages is in removing seasonal effects from time series data. When data exhibits regular seasonal patterns, such as monthly or quarterly cycles, choosing an appropriate moving average, for example, a 12-period moving average for monthly data, can effectively eliminate seasonality and isolate the trend cycle. This allows analysts to focus on the long-term movement without being distracted by repeating seasonal fluctuations. To make this easier to understand, imagine you are tracking your weekly expenses over several months. Some weeks you spend more due to special events, while other weeks you spend less. If you calculate a 3-week moving average, you would average each week's spending with the weeks immediately before and after it. This smooths out sudden spikes, like buying a new gadget one week, and gives you a clearer picture of your overall spending behavior. If you increase this to a 7-week moving average, the line becomes even smoother, showing your general financial trend rather than short-term ups and downs. In this way, moving averages help transform noisy, irregular data into a clearer and more interpretable pattern, making it easier to analyze and forecast future behavior. The classical decomposition method is one of the earliest approaches to analyzing time series data, dating back to the 1920s. Despite its simplicity, it laid the foundation for many modern techniques used today. The goal of this method is to break a time series into three main components: the trend cycle, long-term movement, the seasonal component, repeating patterns, and the remainder, random or unexplained variation. Classical decomposition comes in two main forms, additive and multiplicative, depending on how these components interact with each other. In additive decomposition, the idea is that the components simply add together. The process begins by estimating the trend cycle using a moving average. If the seasonal period, denoted as M, such as 12 for monthly data, is even, a centered moving average like a 2-Essen moving average is used. If it is odd, a simple M-period moving average is sufficient. Once the trend is estimated, it is removed from the original data to produce a detrended series. Next, the seasonal component is calculated by averaging the detrended values for each specific season. For example, averaging all January values, all February values, and so on. These seasonal values are then adjusted so that they sum to zero, ensuring consistency. Finally, the remainder component is obtained by subtracting both the trend and seasonal components from the original data, leaving behind only irregular fluctuations. On the other hand, multiplicative decomposition follows the same general steps, but uses division instead of subtraction. Here, the components are assumed to interact proportionally rather than additively. After estimating the trend cycle, the data is detrended by dividing the original values by the trend. The seasonal component is then computed as the average of these ratios for each season, and the resulting seasonal indices are adjusted so that their total equals the number of seasons, M. The remainder is then found by dividing the original data by both the estimated trend and seasonal components. This approach is particularly useful when seasonal variations increase or decrease in proportion to the level of the data, which is common in economic and financial series. To better understand this, consider a simple example of a clothing store's monthly sales. Suppose the store consistently sells more during December due to holiday shopping. In an additive model, December sales might always be, say, $5,000 higher than average, regardless of overall sales levels. In contrast, in a multiplicative model, December sales might be 30% higher than average, meaning the increase grows as overall sales grow. In both cases, decomposition helps separate the long-term growth of the business, trend, the recurring holiday effect, seasonality, and unexpected changes like a sudden drop due to supply issues, remainder. Although classical decomposition is still taught and occasionally used, it has several important limitations. First, it cannot estimate the trend at the beginning and end of the series because moving averages require data points on both sides. Second, it tends to oversmooth the data, which can hide sharp increases or decreases. Third, it assumes that seasonal patterns remain constant over time, which is often unrealistic. For example, electricity demand patterns have shifted over the years due to the widespread use of air conditioning. Finally, it is sensitive to unusual or extreme values, such as sudden disruptions or anomalies, which can distort the results. Because of these weaknesses, more advanced and flexible methods are generally preferred in modern time series analysis. Official statistical agencies, such as National Bureaus of Statistics, handle large volumes of economic and social time series data. To ensure accuracy and consistency, they have developed more advanced decomposition methods than the classical approach. These methods are specifically designed for commonly reported data frequencies, like monthly and quarterly series. Among the most widely used techniques are variants of the X11 method, the SEATS method, and their modern combined implementation known as X13 Arima SEATS, which is now considered a standard tool for seasonal adjustment in official statistics. The X11 method builds upon classical decomposition, but introduces several important improvements to address its limitations. Unlike classical methods, X11 can estimate the trend cycle for all time points, including the beginning and end of the series. It also allows the seasonal component to gradually change over time, instead of assuming it is fixed. Additionally, X11 can handle real-world complexities such as differences in the number of trading days, holiday effects, and other known influences on the data. One of its key strengths is that it is highly automated and robust, meaning it can handle unusual observations or sudden changes, such as economic shocks, without distorting the overall analysis. Another widely used approach is the SEATS method, which stands for Seasonal Extraction in ARIMA Time Series. Developed by the Bank of Spain, this method relies on statistical modeling techniques, specifically ARIMA models, to separate the components of a time series. While the mathematical details are more complex, the main advantage of SEATS is its strong theoretical foundation and its ability to produce results similar to X11 while using a different modeling framework. Today, both X11 and SEATS are often used together within the X13 ARIMA SEATS system, allowing analysts to benefit from the strengths of both approaches. To understand this in a simple way, imagine the government is analyzing monthly unemployment data. The raw data naturally includes seasonal patterns. For example, unemployment may rise every summer when students enter the job market. Using a method like X13 ARIMA SEATS, analysts can remove these predictable seasonal effects, adjust for calendar differences, such as varying numbers of working days, and isolate the true underlying trend in unemployment. This makes it much easier to determine whether the economy is genuinely improving or worsening, rather than being misled by regular seasonal changes. Overall, these modern decomposition methods are preferred over classical techniques because they are more flexible, more accurate, and better suited to real-world data. They allow for changing seasonal patterns, handle irregular events more effectively, and provide clearer insights for decision-making, especially in areas like economic policy, business forecasting, and public planning. STL decomposition is a flexible and powerful method used to break down time series data into its key components. The name STL stands for Seasonal and Trend Decomposition using LOS, where LOS is a smoothing technique that can capture complex, nonlinear patterns in data. Developed by Robert B. Cleveland and colleagues, STL has become one of the most widely used modern decomposition methods because of how adaptable and reliable it is. One of the biggest strengths of STL is its flexibility compared to older methods like classical decomposition or X11. It can handle any type of seasonality, not just monthly or quarterly data, which makes it suitable even for daily or hourly datasets. Unlike classical methods that assume seasonality is fixed, STL allows the seasonal pattern to change gradually over time, which better reflects real-world situations. It also lets the user control how smooth or responsive the trend cycle should be, depending on the goal of the analysis. Another important advantage is that STL can be made robust to outliers, meaning that unusual events, such as sudden spikes or drops, will not distort the trend or seasonal estimates, but will instead be captured in the remainder component. Despite these advantages, STL also has some limitations. It does not automatically adjust for calendar-related effects, such as holidays or trading days, which must be handled separately if needed. In addition, STL is designed primarily for additive decomposition, meaning it assumes the components are added together. However, if a multiplicative relationship is desired, this can still be achieved by transforming the data, such as taking the logarithm before applying STL and then transforming it back afterward. A key feature of STL is that the user can control how the components behave using parameters called windows. The trend window determines how smooth the long-term movement is, while the seasonal window controls how much the seasonal pattern is allowed to vary over time. Smaller window values make the model more sensitive to rapid changes, while larger values produce smoother, more stable components. For example, setting the seasonal window to periodic forces the seasonal pattern to remain constant across years, while allowing a finite window lets it evolve gradually. To make this easier to understand, imagine you are analyzing daily ride-sharing demand, like Uber or Lyft, in a large city. The trend cycle might show that overall demand is increasing as the service becomes more popular. The seasonal component could capture patterns such as higher demand on weekends and lower demand on weekdays. However, these patterns might change over time. For example, weekend demand may grow even stronger as nightlife expands. STL can adapt to these changes by allowing the seasonal pattern to evolve. Meanwhile, unexpected events like a major concert or a transportation strike would appear in the remainder component without distorting the trend or seasonality if the robust option is used. In summary, STL is a highly practical and modern approach to time series decomposition. Its ability to handle different types of seasonality, adapt to changes over time, and remain stable in the presence of unusual data makes it a preferred choice for analysts who need both accuracy and flexibility in understanding complex time series patterns. That's it for this week. Thank you for joining me, and see you next week.